Hi guys, so today's video is going to be a list of some tearjerker fantasy book recommendations. I personally don't need to even know anything else. The second somebody tells me that a book had them bawling, I'm instantly like, say no more, and then I want to go check out that book. So I figured, even though I can't tell you why these books are sad, because that would be a spoiler, just telling you that these books have some sad stuff in them, they might make you emotional. I thought maybe some of you might be like me, where that's enough. I'll obviously tell you what the books are about, so you at least have an idea of whether they sound like something that you would be interested in picking up. And I do feel the need to clarify, I've personally never cried reading a book, but for those of you that are criers when you read, I think a lot of the ones on this list are gonna get you. I'm gonna kick off the list with the Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wong. I actually buddy read this with some other people who have their own channels, and quite a few of them told me that they were basically weeping when they read this book. You would not think it when you start. So the story follows two main point of views, a mother and her teenage son. Her teenage son is somebody who is very wide-eyed and eager to learn and just really wants to be a good kid, do what he can, and he is very devoted to his tasks. He's very devoted to the kind of mission of his people, which is to keep Kaigen safe. The Sword of Kaigen is this particular area that its people are the first defense against attacks. And so it's kind of ingrained in them that they have to be fighters and that they have to protect everybody else and keep them safe from any attacks that may come. However, there's a lot of themes about the brainwashing of an entire civilization of people, the way in which you can't really question anything, and we start to see this teenage character discovering more about his country and his mother, who kind of has seen things in the past, how she has to fight the desire to tell her son things that maybe go against the propaganda, but also feeling like she can't because of the risk of doing so. This shows the consequences of those things as well as the consequences of war. So when you first get going with this one, you might have to give it some time. It's kind of very different because even though it sounds fantastical, there are kind of modern, almost sci-fi elements at the beginning, like references to video games, and you're like, what am I reading? And there's a whole like CW superhero type plot line off to the side too, and you're like, what is going on? And then it starts to get into a certain section where you're like, oh, now I understand. Next up is a series that I talk about all the time. It is criminally underrated and underhyped, except for by me. I'm constantly hyping it up, and I need more people to read it, and that would be the Ninth Reign. It's technically called the Winnowing Flame Trilogy. The first one is called Ninth Reign. This first one is not emotional. The second one has its moments, you know, but it's the third one. The third one, I was basically a mess after reading it. The whole next day, I was like, I have a book hangover. I was really upset, but in the best way, right? You're upset, but you're also like, oh my gosh, it was so powerful. I can't believe the author could make me feel all these things. So you've probably heard me talk about it before, but if you have not, this follows a world where we have a main character who's kind of like an archaeologist. She's trying to explore some of the evidence of previous wars that mankind doesn't really know too much about. And then there's another group of people called Eborans who do live for a long amount of time. They're kind of like elves. They were the ones that whenever these wars would come, and these wars were inevitable, they were the ones that would protect mankind from this threat, except for now Eborans have basically died off. There's very few left, and that looming threat is present throughout the story. You're just constantly wondering, when is this coming? Is this gonna happen? What even is it? So you follow one character who's an Eborn, the archaeologist character, and then you follow this other perspective that's a witch, and you get to see how these characters come together. The witch aspect of the story is not what you would typically find when you think of witch. The characters, they just feel so real. I absolutely love the interactions between them. They're constantly bickering. The banter between them is fantastic. They just have so much life written into them. Jen Williams, I feel like, masterfully crafted this bizarre world, these amazing characters. And then there's some aspects in the second and third books that just, I really need more people to read it so that other people can understand. It's so good. Please, everybody go read this. Next up, we have the Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. So I have said before, the only other series that made me feel the way that the end of this trilogy made me feel is the Winnowing Flame that I just talked about. This is, I've always said, my all-time favorite trilogy. Winnowing Flame is up there now too. I love these so much. They are not alike when it comes to the premise, just the feelings at the end of the series is very similar. So this one is one that you've likely heard about Mistborn before, but we follow a society where the kind of evil Dark Lord won. We're looking at 1,000 years into what that world would look like if the chosen one didn't win and the bad guy won. And we now see that society's not looking very good. We follow a ragtag group of people as they band together to try and take down this ultimate bad guy. The magic system involves ingesting metals. There are some people that ingesting metals does nothing. Some people that are called mistings, they can ingest a single metal and then have a coordinating power that goes with that. And then there are very rare people called Mistborn. All of the different powers that mistings could have, the Mistborn can have all of them. Some people do find this first one to be sad, but I think the second and third ones are really where it gets a lot of people. Keeping with Brandon Sanderson, I also have to mention the Stormlight Archive series. I personally think that there are so many moments in the series that are going to really hit you hard. There's so many aspects of it too. It's the stakes, it's the fear for your characters, but also there's such an emphasis on the mental health of our different characters, and that is something that is so deeply personal from one reader to the next. And I personally found so many aspects of it to be so tragic but also so powerful, and to see that in a story, especially a fantasy story, I think is absolutely incredible. The setup for Stormlight Archive, it's a little bit difficult to describe because it is epic fantasy and you follow a big cast of characters, a very big world, but at its core we follow different characters that are involved with the kingdom of Roshar. They are at war with this almost humanoid-like group of people known as the Parshendi, and characters are discovering more about the past of Roshar. They're discovering more about their own history. These are definitely really massive books, but the amount of time that we take to really get to know all the different characters means that when anything is happening to a character, you just feel so badly for them. They feel so real. Kaladin especially, oh my gosh. But there's just so many moments throughout this story that are so heartbreaking. Absolutely fantastic. Highly recommend. Next up, we have one that maybe it's just me, I don't know, but that would be the Ash Princess Trilogy by Laura Sebastian. So I have said before that this trilogy is very, very tropey, and it's definitely really entertaining, kind of one ridiculous thing after the next, but I just found myself so engrossed in the story. I was really rooting for the character. I was really enjoying trying to see her rip her way out of her circumstances. So she is somebody who used to be the heir to the throne of this kingdom, and then she was kept when her kingdom was conquered by the conquerors, and she is now used against her own people. If they try to rebel, she will be publicly beat or hurt in some way in front of everyone. So it's kind of like a means of keeping her people in check. Her life is obviously terrible at this point, but she decides she finally wants to do something about her situation, and she starts out kind of as this empty shell of a person, and then now she's trying to find herself again and find her voice and find her power. Despite how heavy it seems like it would be, it really is quite entertaining and tropey. I constantly found I couldn't put the series down, and when it got to this third one, I thought it would once again repeat the same feelings as the first and the second, but I was surprised by how much I cared about these characters in this third book. There's a lot of foreshadowing to things that you maybe think like, oh, this is going to be really predictable, but that might still get you anyway, and I feel like that takes a certain kind of skill. On the topic of YA fantasy, I have to give a shout out to Six of Crows and Crooked Kingdom. I know a lot of you have probably read it. It's a heist story, it's intense stakes, but it's very personal. We follow 6 different characters, we get to know them, the trauma of their past, which is, I feel, where a lot of the emotional pull really comes from. But there's just so many moments where you feel so much for these characters. It seems like it would be a simple heist story, and I think that actually has created an expectation of this that maybe isn't what people end up getting. They think it's going to be a high story, so it's going to be adventure, a good time, just constant page turner, but really it's quite slow at times. And I know that the TV show has come out, so a lot of people also have been exposed to these characters, but the show currently only gives you a hint of these characters, and getting to know them better means that every time something, even the tiniest thing will happen, or there'll be a little interaction between the characters, you're like, I know what that actually means to them, though. And it's just, I love when books can do that. I absolutely love the characters that Leigh Bardugo created in this. Next up, we have one that I personally did not feel that sad over, but everybody seems to feel really depressed by these books. I've only read the first one. I know some people feel emotional by the first one as well, so I wanted to mention it, and that would be Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. This also follows a character that has a lot of mental health focused on them, meaning that they definitely have a lot of depression, and we see what it's like for this character who they're almost robbed of their agency, and what that looks like and how it can kind of strip a person of the desire and the motivation that you would typically find in a lot of fantasy stories. This isn't a heroic person who's going to take down the bad guy. It's kind of just following a character who's caught in the middle of a lot of royalty. So the setup for the story is we follow our main character named Fitz. He is the illegitimate child of somebody who is noble, and therefore he does have some claim to the throne. To keep him from ever trying to have his claim to the throne come into action, they decide better to keep my enemies close, sort of a thing. So from the time that he is a child, he is kept within the circle of all of the nobles, but he doesn't really have any freedom in his life whatsoever. He knows he can never really go about and live his own life, make his own choices. He's constantly being monitored. And that situation, that in and of itself is very kind of dreary, but ultimately, I think a lot of people just feel really connected to Fitz. They feel really connected to a situation. There's also an animal companion aspect to the story that I know a lot of people will really love. Next up, we have The Kingdom of Back by Marie Lu. This is one I never really know how to categorize it because it's kind of historical fiction, kind of magical realism, kind of fantasy, and I definitely think that it's very atmospheric and almost abstract in its story, that it makes it so that if you don't interpret it the same way as I personally interpret it, you might not have that same connection. But ultimately, I think there's so much beauty in this story and so much pain. It follows Nannerl Mozart, who is Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's sister. She was a real person in history. She was actually just as talented, if not more so, than her brother, but due to the sexism of society, she was never recognized the way that she deserved. There's so many themes in the story about being remembered, about your legacy, about your freedom of choice, about the stripping of that and not having any freedom of choice. And it's just so, it hurt so much to read. There's so many lines about just feeling, as you grow older, this awareness of the loss of your innocence and the awareness that you can do nothing about it. It's not really about you. It doesn't matter how good of a person you are. It doesn't matter how skilled or talented you are. It doesn't matter how perfect you fit society's expectations if society does not care about you or thinks of you as lesser. It's so good, but the part of it that makes it fantastical or like magical realism is that Nannerl and Wolfgang, they have this little magical place that they have made up called the Kingdom of Back. And it's this thing that they created to entertain themselves. It's very kind of dark, fae inspired. And you are often wondering, is this actually happening? And that aspect of it is where I think the magical realism comes into play. I think so much of what's happening in that part of the story is mirroring what's going on in the historical fiction parts of the story. I absolutely love it. Highly recommend. Very different from that, we have the Shadow of the Fox Trilogy by Julie Kagawa. This follows two main point of views. We have one who's named Yumeko, and then we have the other who's Tatsumi. Yumeko is this kind of sweet, naive, a little bit mischievous character who she just likes to play little pranks on people. She also has some fox powers that she has to keep hidden for her own safety. And then Tatsumi is this kind of like ninja warrior who ends up having to cross paths and go on this journey with Yumeko. And the two are polar opposites. They could not be more unalike from one another. And they are on this mission that involves a scroll that has the power to kind of change the fate of the entire world. Similar to a couple of the other trilogies I've talked about, I would say it's really in the later books that this gets really emotional. It takes time to connect with these characters, to really feel for them. But then by the end, you've been with them for a while. You get to see the characters not only bond with these two main characters, but other side characters as well. You just really find you feel for everyone, and you are so worried. Just like with Ninth Reign, just like with Mistborn, by the end of the trilogy, the stakes have been raised to incredible heights, and you just so badly want all of your characters to make it out of it, and you're like, I don't know what's gonna happen, and it's just very edge of your seat. I absolutely loved it. Very also kind of cute, some familiar tropes, and it feels very much like a traveling story, so it feels very episodic. It feels like it's unfolding the way that a TV show would. Last on the list would be Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. I wouldn't say that this book is sad the way some of our other books on this list are sad. It's more of the themes in this story about compassion, about forgiveness, and just trying to see the hurt in other people and trying to understand why they, therefore, are hurting other people. And it's incredible. It's very different from what you typically find in fantasy, where violence or magic or just being the best at something and rising to the top and scheming, which I love all of that in a good fantasy story, but this one, it's just very different from all of that. And it also makes you see the world in that way, our own world. You see other people, and you see when somebody is doing something so cruel or when they seem so callous, there's probably something else deep down that's causing that. It is very much like a dark fairy tale, even though this story is YA. I would say it leans older and could have been written as adult, or I should say categorized as adult, because there's some very dark content. It's just more alluded to than shown. But you're following an entire society of people that have had kind of an entire society that has been traumatized by some events. We have a main character who is determined to find out if this one magical place exists. And then we have another character who is blue, and it wouldn't seem like it would get that emotional, but it does. It's absolutely incredible. You'll find yourself hating certain characters, and then you'll find out more about them, and you're like, oh no, I feel so bad for them now. I definitely would love to know more of your recommendations for fantasy books that have made you cry or almost made you cry. I'm always in the mood for that. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.